Cities are where humanity's future will unfold. Leading in this context is inevitably to lead the future in one way or another. A complex future bearing extraordinary opportunity and, of course, challenge. Where the future plays out will be an ongoing conversation with and for senior city leaders, from the public and private, commercial and non-profit, official and not so official arenas. City leadership really is a group effort. Where the future plays out is a conversation about leading better futures, not only in the city context, but beyond its boundaries as well. This is my first conversation, and it was with Aziza Akhmouch, Head of Division for Cities, Urban Policies and Sustainable Development at the acclaimed OECD. I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation and hope you do as well. Dealing with one country or even one city is a profoundly complex thing. You working at OECD, you're exposed to 40 plus countries. What is it that makes you believe that it's worth going into work every morning to make a dent? Where are you seeing the shifts?
The more local you go, the closer to the impact you get. There's a lot of diversity and disparity within the same country in terms of your exposure to these different risks. There are different capacities across cities, rural regions, and so on in terms of how you absorb the shock and you become more resilient. National averages also mask huge disparities and sometimes send a misleading picture of what is really happening in a country. And therefore, you need to go very local, which implies also working with local stakeholders to have what we call place-based understanding of what are the hot potatoes that we have to deal with, what are the solutions that we can target and adopt to those local contexts. But when you combine those two levers, you can really see change happen. You can really see mayors, you can really see ministers, borrowing, using the evidence, the data, the outsider view, the consensus you have built with their own stakeholders in their own places to improve their decisions.
In your world, as a doctor involved with policy, stats, deep tissue research, being profoundly concerned about the veracity of your data, how do you humanize this? When you knock on the door of a mayor or a municipal manager, and those are just the official titles, right? You know as well as I do, if we can't humanize this stuff, we're not going to change the world with spreadsheets, right?
This is a critical question, but the most important part is really the policy dialogue that leads to the report. The way you have consulted the different stakeholders, built consensus on what are the main challenges or the ways forward, acknowledged and done justice to the efforts and the myriad of plans and responses and investments and support that was provided in response to the challenges that you identified, creating a coalition between public, private, non-profit stakeholders in a given city, in a given country that can then make change happen once the OECD's work is completed. And I think for us, working with cities, there are three main ways that we have, let's say, adjusted and changed our work in the last decade in particular. The first one is acknowledging that governance is not just about governments, that even if we work on public policy, most of these public policies are, discharged across levels of government, but in cooperation with a broad range of stakeholders, including the private sector, civil society organizations, and require also behavioral change from citizens themselves. And therefore, if you do not include ex ante the myriad of players that are required to make the solution happen, then it remains a report that is on a shelf. The second starting point for us is to really provide a sort of neutral platform where we can have an open conversation, which requires countries and cities' readiness to open the books, in a transparent way, and neutralize somehow some of the sometimes very sensitive and politicized debates. Because the OECD comes as a third party. We're not an auditor. We're going to make evidence-based recommendations, suggest concrete actions, etc. But we're not going to put a fine on countries if they don't make this happen. We're not going to design sanction mechanisms. In the same way, we're not financing infrastructure. We have no vested interest, let's say, other than improve people's lives. And that third party, which creates the trust and helps put people around the table, is very important also to create an atmosphere where each of the stakeholders is part of the solution, trade-offs can be managed, and really consensus can be built. And then there's a third and last paradigm shift that I've seen in the last decade, which is that we are gradually shifting away from, maybe too detailed, lengthy, analytical work into things that are much more agile, action-oriented, and targeted. For example, we have developed a myriad of checklists, that are very user-friendly. We have gone extremely visual in our data sets so that end users can also play with them and do their own self-assessment, without the OECD necessarily coming and telling them how they perform. We are also setting a number of platforms, the champion mayors, for example, for inclusive growth that gathers the 60 world leaders that are making the fight against inequality a top priority, and doing a series of podcasts and other things that make this a bit more accessible, I would say, than maybe the traditional forms of outputs we were producing decades ago. So all this, in my view, goes in the right direction. You have the people, you have the outputs that are being revised, and you also have the process that is being adjusted to this demand.
So my question was, how do you humanize this? Okay, so you gave me 3 points. The first is really connect with everyone, right? Every relevant stakeholder, okay? We're using that very unhuman, if that's a term, unhuman term for referring to the people that matter, in a city, right? The second is keep it neutral and impartial. Make it clear that you've got no vested interest. You're not soliciting for anything. That's number 2. Number 3 is, instead of delivering mountains of paperwork and mountains of reports, you are delivering more agile, more visually compelling, more accessible pieces of work, which is perhaps accessible to a broader audience. Before we get back to this, I'm asking you as a doctor, as a researcher, as the leader of policy as it pertains to cities at OECD, and I'm also asking Aziza, the friend, the family person, when I ask you what is trust, what comes to mind? Now, before you get to the stats, I'm asking you, right?
For me, trust is inspiration. For me, trust is confidence, connection, willingness to help, to engage, to contribute. Trust comes also with reassurance. Trust is what connects people. Trust is what transforms sometimes different motivations into complementary ones. Trust is what allows, a long-term view and hope and perspective for the future. We have to trust not only our institutions and our leaders, but also our peers and our partners and our friends and our families and our services and amenities. It's multi-layered, but it's a basic requirement for quality of life.
Now, let me get into the more technical stuff. Okay, and I'm asking of the same person, but now you've got your title right on your chest. Aziza, what is trust?
Trust is what can enable change. Trust is what can facilitate consensus, what can drive better understanding of different perspectives. Trust is what takes us beyond individual selfishness to understand community life and public good, let's say, importance at large.
How do you bring all that good stuff into the room when you have sometimes, I'm sure, very official people with informal titles, people from different socioeconomic settings, which are magnified in the city setting often. But when you get them all into the same room, those stakeholders, how do you get that trust thing amidst them so you enjoy all of those good implications?
First, and that's inherent to any stakeholder engagement, clarify very early on how inputs of the consultation are going to be used. and who is expected to contribute to what is the clear objective and the expected outcome. And it's not because you are putting 25 people around the table that this is going to lead to a co-decision or a co-production. And this is absolutely fine. There are different levels of engagement of stakeholders. It can go from sharing information all the way through building consensus, and why not, in the end, higher uptake decisions. But this needs to be clarified ex ante, because if it is not, then you fall either in the typical caveat of what we call the consultation capture, or the consultation fatigue. People have the feeling they've been asked what they think, but then not much is happening because ex ante we didn't, facilitate that understanding. The second point that is extremely important for us as OECD is also full transparency on who we engage, what for, and when. Usually, when we are carrying out policy dialogues, there's a very open, inclusive process done ex ante, whereby, the full list of stakeholders is shared, and nobody gets in a room without knowing basically who is in that room. That's the basic requirement for trust. And it doesn't mean it's going to be easy. It doesn't mean that conversation is going to flow. It doesn't mean you're not going to have awkward moments where sometimes, you're wondering what is going on. And I think sometimes what is not said is equally important to what is actually said. But I would say you have a level playing field, whereby everybody's comfortable up front. We're not meant to trap anyone in any process. And then there is the consultation per se, where there are also a number of rules that need to be facilitated, the neutral moderator. We have many processes that can lead to inclusive consultation. Of course, we did sometimes policy dialogues with 120 stakeholders over a 3-hour consultation. Not everybody can take the floor. But you have technology now that helps you through survey, polls, real-time, active exercises to make sure each stakeholder who wants to speak has a chance to contribute somehow in the process. So the way you run the meeting, the way you ensure that no one is left behind, that everybody gets to share a voice, where you clarify that it's not because a point is made that it's going to be included, or that is going to influence. In the end, the OECD provides an outsider view, but you are absolutely crystal clear and transparent in reverting back to the stakeholders and explaining concretely, this is a very good point, but it's not substantiated. This is a good point, but our evidence shows that, etc. And we do that with each of the stakeholders that voice their concerns at some point of the process. And then there's the third and last step, which is what happens after the consultation process, having also a process whereby those that have been consulted at some point of the process get to see the zero draft of what could become the OECD analysis and share a final round of views, comments, etc. Again, with the clear understanding that the OECD is managing the final trade-off, and that member countries, of course, are the ones that are scrutinizing the content and approving it. But I think all this process, at the end, for me, the most beautiful part of the job is when we are done with the report, the data set, the analysis, the action plan, the checklist, etc. Things happen that we would never have suspected. An NGO goes to the media and holds the government accountable for that commitment or that recommendation because it was somehow associated at some point of the process. And this sort of butterfly effect is what makes us think sometimes that, part of the job is done and some change is going to happen. But I think if you create that coalition of the willing, in a way that is sufficient, transparent, trustworthy, etc., you can be amazed and surprised by the level of change that this is going to trigger in the country, because those stakeholders know way better their constituencies and their places than we will ever, regardless of the number of consultations we carry out. So we see ourselves really as enablers, as facilitators, as promoters. We bring the technical expertise, but we're also very humble in understanding that the places, that the people are the ones that can really make that change happen.
As someone who's trying to be impartial here and really listen to you, I must admit I've just
I've just experienced a bit of a fail. I got fixated on a word you used. You said one of the beautiful things that happens. One of the beautiful things that happens is the unexpected. And that unexpected thing that wasn't planned for, it wasn't on your huge, I'm being facetious now, on your huge OECD menu, okay? But it happened. The unexpected happened, and it created the change, which is beyond anything anyone planned for,
Yeah.
but wouldn't have happened if you brought the coalition of the willing together, which is a wonderful thing. We can only tee up for the unexpected, right? We can't plan for the unexpected. Another word you've used, which I find, from my perspective, critical, and that is solidarity. It's one that we use almost as often as sustainability or strategy or marketing or even trust. How does one bring solidarity to an arrangement between regions or countries or role players? How do you do that?
You know, it's a very good question, because under the empire of necessity, solidarity becomes way more challenging than when everybody's thriving. And I tend to be optimistic because I've seen things during this pandemic that I would never have thought were that possible. I think we've seen in very local settings how many of us started being caring, you know, for our not only families and friends, but also our neighbors. The rediscovery of proximity, you know, and myself, I discovered some of the neighbors in the building where I was living for 3 years, because I started worrying, thinking, is there someone maybe who is old and doesn't have family and is stuck in the lockdown? And I was just knocking at doors and going around, and which in the old world where, you know, we're all like in our daily routine and work and kids and school and, you know, complete traffic, we don't always open the eyes. So and I think there's a lot in the social economy that has happened with intergenerational forms of solidarities, with even, you know, citizens engaging with food banks. Local governments also are targeting the most vulnerable, you know, trying to um, you know, avoid evictions for unpaid rent, freezing, you know, some of the. So we've seen a sort of revival of forms of happy proximity and solidarity that maybe we were not seeing any longer in the past. Then, of course, at the global level, unfortunately, we have not witnessed a similar engagement. When we look at the vaccine spread in OECD and developing countries, it's very disappointing. You know, this first reaction to close the borders, to target the well-being of one's citizens first and foremost, to get vaccinated in advanced economies, and then what we see today, of course, with the resurgence of waves, is because as long as we have not fixed the issue globally, we're just not getting out of it. You know, so we see the cost of the absence of solidarity.
It seems to me that if we suffer in closer proximity to each other, we are more likely to be compelled to show solidarity to the other. The notion that we are physically, literally in this together. So there's a relationship between our proximity and suffering that can, at least as human beings, afford us the opportunity to show solidarity. Would you say that's fair?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think so.
And maybe that's one of our profound challenges. There's not only X thousand miles between the global north, so to speak, and the global south, but there are also paradigms, and there's also a lack of feeling of commonality. And it's difficult when you are materially safe and materially comfortable to feel for anyone else. Yet, despite our close physical proximity, we're actually worlds apart. How do we break those barriers?
I think the feeling of cohesion for me goes with the feeling of belonging to a same place, a same entity, and goes in terms of the scale beyond the pure administrative boundary of the city. It should be based on where people actually work and live. And what we've seen recently with this pandemic is the rise of a discourse around, for example, the 15-minute city. You must have heard that, which in other places than Paris and big capital cities that are now borrowing this concept that has gone viral and is extremely interesting. It's this idea that instead of continuing to drive people from point A to point B, we should rethink the amenities and the services around places where people live. And these amenities are not just I go for work, it's I have access to school, I have access to leisure, I have access to transport, to a doctor, everything that is this multidimensional aspect of well-being. Now, of course, not every city can have its hospital. You need a functional, for some of these amenities, at regional level, you need a functional scale. But the concept is very interesting. Now, what is the risk? The risk is that we create new forms of spatial segregation, whereby we have neighborhoods that are becoming kind of self-sufficient, disconnected from one another, and not equally accessible to different social groups. You need that 15-minute city or 10 or 20 or half an hour territory. You have many creative concepts that are emerging to be extremely well connected to the surrounding areas. And for that, you need transport. Public transport is the lever that drives territorial cohesion. This discourse that we need, and that is also carbon neutral driven, about the bicycle and walking and clean forms of urban mobility, it's an absolute must have. I mean, I'm not saying this is not the direction, but it shouldn't mask the real debate, which is the heavy investment that we need in transports and the density and the quality of transport, because this is the public transport that can reconnect rural urban areas and somehow mitigate those forms of spatial segregation. And therefore, you need some mobility within the proximity. It's not either or. And as long as we are not, let's say, giving a strong reality check to that discourse on accessibility, we are remaining in a sort of elitist view of what the city should be for a few happy few, basically. And then those a bit away, it's okay to use your car as long as you don't come to the core urban center where we can cycle. It's, and I think that split is also contributing to discontent, to frustration, to lack of understanding of why we need to transition to a low carbon economy and so on. So really, public goods, public services are essential to mitigate, and reduce the risks of gentrification and spatial segregation that we are facing in our cities, in particular the big ones.
You also mentioned that there's a preliminary indication or preliminary findings that are showing a connection between trusted governments and uptake of vaccinations. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, it's exploratory work, but we have basically documented across OECD countries recently a sort of a positive correlation between trust and attitudes towards vaccination, both among and within countries. The message is that building and or maintaining citizen trust in the government and in the health authorities can directly support vaccine acceptance, and through this basically general recovery efforts. And this is all the more important when you go local, because we know that there is a much higher level of trust of citizens in their local governments, in their mayors, in their presidents of regions than there is in their national government. Since the 2009 global financial crisis, between 50 and 60% of citizens in OECD countries, on average, huge disparities from one country to another, tell you they have no trust in the capacity of their national governments to deliver their basic services and ensure their well-being. And it's proportionally the opposite when you go local. So local mayors and territorial stakeholders, because of the proximity, because of the communication, because of the types of works they do on a very daily basis to solve concrete problems for their urban dwellers are key, players in that system of vaccines as well. And we've seen many countries relying increasingly on subnational governments and this proximity to secure the buy-in. So I think this is an interesting, let's say, ex ante explanation of the longer term benefits of building trust in institutions.
So now let's land it with cities. By both your and my admission, no one has got a definitive and final handle on what trust means everywhere in the world in every context. But the OECD is profoundly well placed to flag up causality where it exists and correlations where it may exist. So here we go. What would you tell a city leader in whatever sphere of influence they may find themselves? What would you tell them with regards to the correlations between trust and enabling better city futures? And secondly, how do they bring trust back into the four city world?
I think the starting point for a city leader is to get to a situation where urban dwellers live in the city because they have chosen to and not because they have to. And the have to is because they have to work. And the way the city leader can do that is to make the city more attractive on a myriad of dimensions, people-centered dimensions related to well-being, so that it's very clear for the urban dweller that the benefits of living in a city are much higher than the costs. Working on hot potatoes that are related to urban safety, traffic congestion, air pollution, housing affordability, connectivity, transport, nature and green amenities, but also leisure, culture, because those are essential services, contrary to what we heard during the pandemic, to make the city more attractive so that people can thrive and live there because they have chosen to, than because they have no choice. The second recommendation to bring trust back in the city, I think, is also to acknowledge that a lot of the radical transformation that are needed to transition to more sustainable pathways in urban, but also in rural settings, should be a shared responsibility between the public authorities. There's a clear need for public policies that are ambitious, robust, time-bound, accountable, etc., but also individual behavioral change. The city will only change if we change the way we live in the city. And so how you make that transition between the stick and the carrot that you as a mayor can put out there to an individual conviction that there are things you can do at your scale, household, neighborhood, etc., that can radically improve your quality of life is through dialogue. It's really the dialogue, the close proximity, the conversation, the right incentives that can help, let's say, unpack these individual levels of actions that are needed in cities. And I'll give you one example. For example, I think that one of the missed opportunities of this crisis that we still have to think of, and that many mayors are now looking at, is how we can change drastically our relationship to time in cities. This idea that maybe with the digital revolution and teleworking revolution, we are not all obliged any longer to do the same thing at the same time, at the same place, and that maybe we can synchronize, desynchronize, resynchronize our social lives in a way that we minimize pressure on land, we minimize pressure on public services, and so on. Maybe we don't need to all pack in crowded transportation to get to the office at 9 a.m. Or, it's, and that new relationship to time, chrono-urbanism, is also a way to rethink our infrastructure. What is a school, a bar, something else at a given moment of the day can be something else at another moment of the day. But this requires readiness from individual, urban dwellers to do things differently. And then there's a third and last block, which is really the, let's say, the transparency, the performance of public policy. And that goes to the data part, that goes to the disclosure, The lessons from best practices, but the lessons from failure, which is also difficult. But I find always mayors way more humble. I was impressed by the mayor of Helsingborg, who was telling me recently, we have set up a prize to fail in our cities. We
Say that
are
again.
every
You
year
have set
giving
up.
a prize to fail.
Ah,
We are giving every year a prize, a reward to the biggest failure mistake ever that a public official has made, as long as he or she has learned and drawn lessons. Can you imagine the incentive this is setting? And I think so. Really, the data, the accountability, the transparency, and making this accessible and showing, to the urban dwellers that this is a long-term effort is something that can also generate this human benevolence and transparency and empathy that then builds the trust for not only one political mandate, but maybe two or three to make change happen. I think if we combine those three things, we set the ground and we bring, some of the trust back uh, and rebuild a sort of new social contract or that can contain this geography of discontent that we've seen rise over the past years.
if the city leader manages to do that, to bring trust back into their city, what are the benefits that they're going to enjoy? And conversely, if city trust or trust within the city setting remains low or begins to deteriorate, what is the city leader going to experience as a result?
I think we seek very tangible way. First, satisfaction with life, satisfaction with the city, political support, feeling of belonging, feeling of engagement, higher engagement in public life, in the civic space. Those are all cascade effects, let's say, of a leader that is inspirational, that is charismatic, that is trustworthy, that is pointing to the right direction. And this leads to policy continuity because you can have longer mandates, the vote of confidence can be renewed, and so on. So I think definitely the greater buy-in of reforms, the trade-offs you manage on a daily basis, and the peaceful environment where you can do your job is to be noted. And then on the other side, you can have all the traditional resistance, blockages, deadlock that can hinder public action, that force you to step back, that force you to postpone to a few years reforms that are urgent today because they don't have the level of acceptance and buy-in that is required because you're not compensating properly those that are losing from the reform. We know each reform has losers, and needs to have a social targeted accompanying measures. You're not able to scale up your action. So there's direct costs and benefits. I think the biggest challenge for local political constituencies is often the time, how you manage short time pressure with long-term benefits. But really going back to what I was saying in the introduction, trust is a prerequisite for any public action to actually materialize and deliver the intended benefits. This is the starting point.
I think, in summary, we've spoken about a very complex world. We've spoken where there are points of hope if we bring trust into the room. In that world in which the city leader finds him or herself, what would your takeaway for them be?
I think I think I'm not an elected official myself. I've never been, and it's a very hard job from the iterations we've had with many mayors over the past few years. But I think I would tell them they're the go-to persons to make change happen. They're on the front line of understanding what matters for people at the local level and how their life can be drastically changed and improved with their action. I would tell them to remember that some of these actions require cooperation, collaboration with other constituencies, um, rural areas beyond the city boundaries, national governments, for a number of public policies. And I would tell them that it's always so pleasant to see how mayors manage sometimes to change a city in 3 years, with creative mix of social, economic, environmental measures, and the collective intelligence and wisdom of their urban dwellers, building the capacity, pouring the funding and co-producing what could be the city of tomorrow. So there's a lot of hope.
I will also add something, and it's something that you've just taught me earlier in the conversation, and that is the probability is that they are the most trusted leader around, which to my mind is a wonderful gift and also a wonderful responsibility to steward as well. And if there's an agent of change, research tells us that it's probably they are the most trusted agent for that change.